August 7th, 1944. Just after 12:15 hours. At number 83, Group's advanced landing grounds in Normandy, the first Typhoons are already back on the ground and being turned around. Ground crews are sprinting with fuel lines and rocket rails, working against the clock, while the pilots climb out, shouting what they've seen. Numbers 174 and 181 squadrons lifted off at 12:15 and 12:25 hours respectively, drove north toward the sound of a battle that had been running since before dawn, and found, on the hedge-lined road between Barthélemy and Chérence via Belle Fontaine, something that fighter-bomber pilots train for and rarely encounter in such concentrated form. 50 to 60 tanks and approximately 200 other vehicles packed nose to tail on a narrow Norman road, stalled in the open, with nowhere to go. The fog that had protected the German advance all morning had burned off. The tanks, apparently, had not expected the sky to clear so quickly. Wing Commander Charles Green, commanding number 121 Wing, had spotted the concentration minutes earlier from a reconnaissance pass at low altitude and radioed it in. His description was brief and sufficient. Tanks on the road from Barthélemy to Chérence, column still moving, no air cover overhead. Within minutes, the first two rocket-armed squadrons were airborne and heading for the coordinates. What those first pilots found when they arrived was a gift and a problem simultaneously. The gift was obvious: a column of German armour compressed into a road corridor it couldn't leave. Bocage hedgerows rising on both sides, vehicles so tightly stacked that the lead elements and the tail were within a few kilometres of each other. The first attack targeted both ends of the column deliberately. Knock out vehicles at the front and rear simultaneously, seal the column in place, then work through whatever was trapped between. The Typhoons dived on the front and rear sections, firing their rockets and pulling through, and the column stopped. It stopped almost immediately, and the smoke from burning vehicles at each end rose high enough to mark the target for the next wave already inbound. From 07:30 to dusk, the shuttle service ran without interruption. Fresh squadrons arrived every 20 minutes, refueled, rearmed, and returned. By nightfall, number 83 Group had flown approximately 294 sorties over 8.5 hours, expending 2,088 RP-3 rockets and 80 tons of bombs. The scale of what had happened in that afternoon felt enormous to everyone who participated in it. Then the intelligence officers opened their debrief notebooks. 84 German tanks destroyed, 35 more probably destroyed, classified as smokers, 21 damaged. 54 motor transport vehicles also claimed destroyed, 19 probably, 39 damaged. In one afternoon, number 83 Group appeared to have devastated the armoured thrust that had threatened to split the Allied breakout in two. The pilots knew they'd stopped something. Everyone who had seen those columns strung out on the bocage roads, smoke rising from both ends and then from the middle, aircraft working them over in rotation, everyone knew it. 5 days later, on the morning of August 13th, investigators from the 21st Army Group Operations Research Section drove into the same fields. They were analysts and scientists, not soldiers. Their task was simple: count what remained, examine each wreck, attribute each kill to its cause. Of the 43 German tanks left behind in the survey area, 7 showed signs of having been struck by a rocket projectile. 7. 84 claimed. 7 confirmed. That ratio, roughly 12 to 1, sounds like scandal, or cover-up, or proof that the entire afternoon was an exaggeration. The story built around those numbers for the next several decades treated it as exactly that, The Typhoon's famous tank-buster reputation exposed as inflated propaganda. That reading misses what the numbers actually prove. The 7 versus 84 gap doesn't demonstrate failure, it demonstrates a measurement problem. The pilots were counting the wrong casualties. Once you understand what 2,088 rockets actually did to a German panzer column trapped on narrow Norman roads in August 1944, not what they destroyed, but what they made impossible, the claim sheet's failure as a measurement tool becomes the most revealing document in the entire file. The Typhoon worked at Mortain. The myth just measured it wrong. Operation Lüttich was, by the summer of 1944, the last major German counter-offensive hope in Normandy, and its origins were in equal parts strategic desperation and Hitler's direct command. On July 25th, American forces broke out of the bocage at Saint-Lô in Operation Cobra. Patton's Third Army immediately began pouring westward and southward through Avranches, threatening to sweep behind the entire German position in France. Hitler's response was to strip armour from other sectors, including from the British and Canadian front around Caen, and drive it westward, aiming to sever the American corridor at Avranches itself. His order specified the attack should proceed recklessly to the sea, regardless of the risk. German commanders on the ground understood the problems. General Eberbach, who assembled the attacking force, and Field Marshal von Kluge, who came personally to watch the start of the assault, both knew the intelligence picture was compromised. Allied codebreakers had read the planning signals almost as they were sent. American forces had warning enough to move the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, into the path of the attack, though barely. Von Kluge chose to proceed regardless. The force that crossed the start line at approximately 100 hours on August 7th was substantial. 2nd SS Panzer Division on the southern axis, 2nd Panzer Division through the centre, 116th Panzer Division pushing north. The 1st SS Panzer Division joined the battle as it developed around St. Barthélemy. Total armoured vehicles participating in the initial assault was somewhere between 177 and the higher figures sometimes cited. Sources differ on what was participating versus committed but held in reserve, and the distinction matters less than the scale. This was 4 panzer divisions attempting a single, coordinated breakthrough on a front where the road network dictated everything. The bocage worked against them almost immediately. The thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, and narrow Norman roads that had frustrated Allied tank operations for 2 months were equally confining for the German attack. The columns had to move in sequence, nose to tail, along road corridors that offered no room to disperse. This created a vulnerability that was invisible for as long as the weather held. The fog on the morning of August 7th was dense enough to ground Allied air operations completely. Through that protective canopy, German armour advanced substantially in the opening hours. The 2nd SS Panzer Division captured Mortain itself. The 2nd Panzer Division pushed through Saint-Barthélemy, Chérence and Le Mesnil-Adélé before noon, several kilometres into American territory, reaching the closest German armour would come to Avranches during the entire operation. American patrols from the 30th Infantry Division first encountered German reconnaissance elements at around 0100 hours, moving along a lane from Grand Dove to Le Mesnil-Adélé. The division fought back with 57mm anti-tank guns, bazookas and artillery, including fire called down from a surrounded battalion holding the steep ground of Hill 317 above the town. Their resistance was ferocious and consequential. It was also, without air support, insufficient to stop the advance. The mist began lifting between 1100 and 1200 hours. At Allied Air Headquarters, the response was immediate. Air Vice Marshal Broadhurst received a telephone call from Air Vice Marshal Green, the senior air staff officer of 2nd TAF, with a simple instruction: commit all of No. 83 Group's resources to the threatened sector between Mortain and Sourdeval. The division of labour with the US 9th Tactical Air Command was clean. British rocket-armed Typhoons against the armoured columns. American fighters providing air superiority overhead and preventing Luftwaffe interference. General Bulovius, commanding Jagd Corps II, had promised up to 300 sorties to cover the German attack. He delivered considerably fewer. American fighters intercepted German formations from their own airfields outward, and at 17:40 hours that afternoon, Luftwaffe Colonel von Scholz was forced to report apologetically to 7th Army headquarters. Our fighters were hard-pressed by enemy fighters from the moment they took to the air. They couldn't reach the target area. The German armour, by mid-afternoon, had no air cover, no ability to manoeuvre off the road network without losing operational coherence, and an air force working it over in 20-minute rotation shifts. At 15:20 hours, a message reached German command recording that the 1st SS Panzer Division's attack had been brought to a complete halt as a result of fighter-bomber action in a position 2 kilometers east of Juvigny. At 19:40 hours, the 7th Army Chief of Staff telephoned Supreme Command West to report that the armoured attack had been at a standstill since 1300 hours due to the employment of fighter bombers by the enemy and the absence of our own air support. 6 hours before those reports were filed, the advance had stopped. Pilots were still filing claim chits. Intelligence officers were still compiling numbers. From those numbers came the figure that would define and distort the Typhoon's reputation for the next 50 years. The 84 tank figure didn't come from anywhere dishonest. It came from the standard RAF claim filing procedure, designed specifically to impose accountability on battlefield results. Each pilot, after landing, was debriefed individually by a squadron intelligence officer. The process was thorough by any reasonable standard. Each target was classified using established vocabulary. Flamers for observed fires or explosions indicating destruction. Smokers for smoke rising from a struck vehicle suggesting probable damage. Damaged for visible impact with uncertain result. Intelligence officers exercised independent judgment, and corroborating accounts from other pilots could strengthen or weaken a specific claim's classification. The system was created with genuine intent to prevent inflation. The structural flaw was invisible at the design level. No mechanism existed in real time to cross-reference claims from different aircraft attacking the same targets. The practical consequence unfolded like this. Across every 20-minute rotation, a pilot from number 174 Squadron dives on a column at 13:20 hours, fires his 8 rockets, watches a vehicle burst into flame, and pulls away into a climbing turn to put distance between himself and the ground fire. His debrief 30 minutes later produces a flamer. 20 minutes after his attack, a pilot from a different squadron arrives at the same road, finds a burning vehicle at the column's head and attacks others nearby, and files his own claim for the vehicles he struck. A third aircraft arrives at 1400 hours. By then, the original fire has generated a substantial smoke column visible for miles. Vehicles that were undamaged but whose crews have fled the repeated attacks stand stationary in the road, indistinguishable from the air from destroyed ones. The third pilot reports multiple flamers. 3 aircraft, 3 independent debrief sessions. 3 sets of intelligence officers receiving those reports had no shared database of what targets had already been claimed. No fraud. No exaggeration. A system doing exactly what it was designed to do, producing an aggregate that was structurally inevitable once you understood how many aircraft were hitting the same concentrated stretch of road in rotation. The physical conditions made it considerably worse. RP-3 rockets generate dense smoke trails on launch, visible in every surviving frame of camera gun footage from the Normandy campaign. Each 60-pound warhead at impact generates a substantial blast cloud of its own. Over 8 hours of continuous attack on an already burning column, with dozens of sorties hitting overlapping sectors, the airspace above the Mortain road network was layered with smoke from multiple sources simultaneously. Rocket impacts, burning vehicles, cannon fire against soft-skinned vehicles, dust thrown up from bocage soil disturbed by repeated strike. By mid-afternoon, the official RAF account noted, clouds of dust and smoke hung over the battlefield, which made it difficult for the pilots to identify their targets. Pilots entering dives from 8,000 feet were looking through that layer at a partially obscured target, making aim corrections by eye, firing, and then pulling away into the smoke. At pull-out, the target was already behind and below, invisible. No assessment was possible in the seconds available before the next aircraft behind you entered its own dive, and the pattern continued. Recognition failure added another layer entirely. Any armoured vehicle, a half-track SDK FZ-251, a tank destroyer, a self-propelled artillery piece, an armoured command vehicle, appeared broadly similar to a battle tank from a diving fighter at speed and altitude. The ORS would note this explicitly in its findings. Pilots were inclined to report any armoured vehicle as a tank, regardless of its actual type. The 84 claimed tanks almost certainly included vehicles of several categories, mixed together in the smoke and movement of a bocage battle. None of this was an RAF pathology. On the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, American aircrew claimed 309 Luftwaffe fighters destroyed. German records documented approximately 40 losses, an overclaim ratio approaching 8-1. During the Battle of Britain, both German and British pilot claims ran significantly ahead of confirmed losses. Soviet Air Force overclaiming at Kursk in July 1943 reportedly exceeded 700%. The Mortain ratio of roughly 12-1 was severe, but structurally explainable by the same forces operating in every tactical air force of the war. Simultaneous attacks on identical targets, obscuration, speed, the brevity of the attack pass, and the complete absence of any real-time cross-checking between independently debriefed pilots. The pilots weren't wrong about what they experienced. They were wrong about what caused it. To understand why, you need to understand the RP-3 as a physical object and as an accuracy problem. And more specifically, you need to put yourself in the cockpit of a Typhoon on an attack run, because the numbers only make sense when you can feel the timeline they were working within. The 3-inch rocket projectile entered RAF service in 1943. In the configuration used at Mortain, it carried a 60-pound semi-armour-piercing warhead containing 17 pounds of high explosive in a steel body designed to deform and then rupture on impact. The complete weapon weighed 91 pounds. 8 of them hung on external rails under each Typhoon's outer wing panels. After launch, the solid fuel motor accelerated the projectile to approximately 1,600 feet per second within 500 yards. after which the motor burned out and the weapon coasted ballistically, decelerating against air resistance, following whatever trajectory the aircraft's attitude and the atmosphere dictated at the moment of release. The weapon was unguided. Once the motor burned out, it went wherever it was pointing. The standard attack profile against a defended target began with a 60-degree dive initiated at 8,000 feet. A shallow attack, 25 degrees, was used against lightly defended targets, beginning at 3,500 feet, with rockets released at 1,500 feet. Against anything that was shooting back, the steep dive was mandatory. All 8 rockets were fired as a single salvo as the aircraft passed through 4,000 feet, at a slant range of roughly 1,700 yards from the target. The pilot then pulled immediately into a zoom climb to clear the ground fire envelope as quickly as possible. From the moment the dive began to the moment the rockets left the rails and the pilot was hauling back on the stick, the geometry of an accurate shot existed for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds at close to 400 miles per hour in a 60-degree dive, pulling 2 or 3 Gs on the recovery, with the target, a vehicle perhaps 15 feet long, somewhere below and ahead in a layer of smoke, while the anti-aircraft fire that had been tracking you since you rolled in is still coming up. RAF operational research on rocket accuracy, drawn from actual combat attacks conducted in April and May 1944, produced the specific figure that appears in the RAF Centre for Air Power Studies journal. Under combat conditions, the 50% zone for rocket impact was 75 yards from the aiming point. Half of all rockets fell within 75 yards. Half fell outside that radius entirely. Given that a tank presents a target area of roughly 200 square feet, the probability of an 8-rocket salvo achieving at least 1 direct hit on an individual tank worked out to approximately 0.7%, less than 1%, per salvo, against an individual tank, even stationary. The sources of that inaccuracy were physical and essentially irreducible in the cockpit conditions of 1944. A 150-yard error in judging firing range, made by eye in a dive with the ground approaching, caused rockets to impact 15 yards short or past the target. 4 degrees of side slip at the moment of launch, which a flinch away from incoming flak could induce instantly, displaced impact by 50 yards sideways at 1,000 yards firing range. A 20-mile-per-hour crosswind, if not corrected precisely during the final seconds of the dive, added 33 yards of lateral error. Any single one of those inputs was sufficient to cause all 8 rockets to miss a 15-foot vehicle completely. Any 2 of them stacked, and in combat they frequently did, meant the rockets landed in the field beside the road. Against a Panther tank, a direct hit was physically difficult, even when everything went perfectly. The Panther's front hull armour, angled at 55 degrees, presented effective protection, equivalent to roughly 140 millimeters of vertical plate, beyond the RP-3 warhead's reliable penetration capability. The Panther's top armour, the surface theoretically most vulnerable to a steeply angled rocket descending from above, was only 15 to 16 millimeters thick. Hitting it required both a direct hit and the geometrically correct impact angle. All of this from an aircraft already operating at sub 1% individual hit probability under combat conditions. Against the Panzer IV, more common in some of the attacking units, the side armour was 30 millimeters. More vulnerable, but still demanding the kind of precision that the combat environment couldn't reliably provide. The RAF had acknowledged this limitation before Normandy. By August 1943, the RP-3 was officially categorized as not a precision weapon, best used against large targets rather than individual armoured vehicles. Against shipping, against troop concentrations, against vehicle columns as collective entities, the rocket was effective. Against a single tank with a competent crew in cover, it was a harassment weapon. The question that mattered at Mortain was what harassment at scale, delivered continuously, actually accomplished. What a near miss did to a tank crew was something quite different from what it did to the vehicle. A 60-pound warhead detonating within close proximity of an armoured vehicle generated blast pressure capable of damaging external fittings, vision ports, and running gear without penetrating the hull. Track damage from near misses was possible. More critically, the crew inside a buttoned-up tank, experiencing rocket impacts in their immediate vicinity, had no reliable way to distinguish a near miss from a ranging shot preceding a direct hit. The official RAF report on the Mortain action, drawing on prisoner interrogation, stated the dynamic plainly. Interrogation of prisoners has shown without question that German tank crews are extremely frightened of attacks by RP. Crews are very aware that if an RP does hit a tank, their chance of survival is small. It's admitted that the chances of a direct hit are slight. Nevertheless, this would hardly be appreciated by a crew whose first thought would be of the disastrous results if a hit was obtained. That sentence does the work of several academic papers. Crews knew, intellectually, that most rockets would miss, but a crew that had survived 3 near misses in 20 minutes, with more aircraft visibly circling overhead, faced a concrete calculation. Stay in the vehicle and accept the ongoing statistical risk of the one direct hit that would kill everyone inside, or leave the vehicle and survive with near certainty. A tank crew under repeated near-miss attack isn't running a probability calculation. They're listening to the howl of incoming rockets and feeling the shock transmitted through the hull when one detonates 30 feet away. Rational crews left. The vehicles they abandoned were intact. The ORS would later record them as such. But those vehicles weren't going anywhere either. That is the gap between the measurement and the effect. The claim sheet had a column for flamers, a column for smokers, and a column for damaged. There was no column for vehicle intact, crew in hedgerow, advance therefore impossible. The 21st Army Group Operations Research Section arrived at the Mortain battle area on the evening of August 12th, the same day German forces completed their withdrawal. A parallel team from 2nd TAF deployed simultaneously. Both organizations worked independently, examined the same ground, and reached essentially identical conclusions. Primary examination took place on August 13th, from 0730 to 1500 hours. Picture the scene the investigators encountered as they drove those lanes in the clear August morning. Wrecked and abandoned German vehicles scattered across a landscape that showed every sign of a sustained air campaign. Scorched earth beside the roads, bomb craters in fields, hedgerows torn open where vehicles had tried to push through into cover. And among it all, German armoured vehicles in varying states of destruction sitting where their crews had left them, or where the weapons of No. 83 Group and the 30th Infantry Division had put them. The investigative methodology was exacting and difficult in equal measure. For each vehicle, the team attempted to determine cause of abandonment or destruction. Rocket projectile impact left specific signatures, entry holes of the right diameter and fragmentation pattern, damage concentrated on surfaces vulnerable to a steeply angled projectile, evidence of the warhead's semi-armor-piercing detonation sequence. Anti-tank gun damage looked different. Cleaner penetrations, different fragmentation geometry, different location on the vehicle relative to the gun line. Bomb damage was identifiable from crater proximity and blast pattern. Mechanical failure showed in drivetrain components. Crew-destroyed vehicles showed deliberate internal damage, fire from the inside out, or charges placed at vulnerable points. And then there were the vehicles with no damage signature whatsoever. Parked, intact, abandoned. One vehicle documented in the analysis illustrates the attribution challenge that ran through the entire survey. An SDKFZ 251 half-track showed evidence of a high-explosive projectile hit, with damage consistent with either an air-launched rocket or a field artillery round. The angle of impact, the fragmentation pattern, the absence of definitive crater evidence nearby, none of it was decisive. The investigators recorded it as inconclusive. This ambiguity was the constant companion of every judgment they made. The battlefield had been a live combat zone for 5 days before they arrived, with ground fighting, artillery exchanges, vehicle movement by both sides, and German recovery operations all altering the physical evidence. Those German recovery operations matter significantly for understanding the number that emerged. The ORS examined only what the Germans couldn't or chose not to remove before withdrawing on August 12th. Any tank damaged by rockets but still mobile enough to be towed, its running gear fouled but its hull intact and recoverable, would have been taken back by German salvage teams and wouldn't appear in the survey count at all. A rocket-caused mobility kill, the vehicle stopped but the crew alive and the hull unbreached, was precisely the kind of kill most susceptible to recovery. German engineering units in Normandy were efficient at this work. The investigators acknowledged the limitation directly and reportedly flew over the survey area to confirm no additional vehicles were present on the ground beyond those they had already examined. In total, the survey area contained 78 armoured vehicles and 128 other vehicles. Against the combined Allied pilot claims of approximately 480 vehicles destroyed or damaged, including 252 armoured vehicles, investigators found 206 total. Of the 43 tanks and 3 self-propelled guns examined in sufficient detail to assign cause, 19 had been destroyed by ground anti-tank weapons. 7 showed evidence of rocket projectile impact. 2 had been destroyed by bombs. 4 showed destruction from causes the investigators couldn't determine. And 11 had been abandoned intact or destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The 30th Infantry Division's anti-tank crews, working the ground with 57mm guns and bazooka teams, had done more direct killing than the Typhoons. 19 vehicle kills attributed to ground weapons, more than double the rocket total. The aircraft that everyone remembered stopping the attack, the aircraft that had been working those roads all afternoon in relays, produced 7 confirmed kills from 2,088 rockets and 294 sorties. That's roughly 88 rockets per confirmed kill, or 11 sorties. The 7 figure needs honest qualification on both sides. The ORS analysis was constrained by what remained in a defined survey area, concentrated north of Mortain, rather than across the full width of the German deployment. Some broader tabulations of ORS data across the entire Lüttich engagement cite figures closer to 10 confirmed rocket kills, reflecting a wider geographic scope. A range of 7 to 10 against 84 claimed and 2,088 rockets expended. The absolute number shifts slightly depending on survey boundary, but no defensible construction of the data gets the rockets anywhere near what the pilots reported. The ratio holds regardless. And the most important numbers in the ORS findings aren't the 7, they're the 11. 11 tanks abandoned intact or destroyed by their own crews. 11 vehicles not struck by rockets, not by bombs, not by anti-tank rounds. Mechanically functional vehicles that stopped advancing and were left because their commanders ordered them to stop or their crews chose to stop. Those 11 vehicles are the suppression effect, given a body count and a location on a map. They are what the claim sheet couldn't measure. Werner Josipite was a non-commissioned officer with the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, and his account of the August 7th attacks is the most direct available description of what the rockets looked and felt like from below. The fighter bombers circled in a pattern, he remembered, breaking off one at a time to dive on targets before rejoining the circle overhead, a new wave arriving as the previous one departed. It was organised and relentless. The fighter bombers circled our tanks several times. Then one broke out of the circle, sought its target, and fired. As the first pulled back into the circle of about 20 planes, a second pulled out and fired. And so they continued until they had all fired. Then they left the terrible scene. A new swarm appeared in their place and fired all their rockets. What Josipite saw from the ground was the shuttle service from the receiving end. Aircraft overhead at all times. The interval between attacks never long enough to feel safe. Smoke rising from every direction. Black clouds of smoke from burning oil climbed into the sky everywhere we looked. They marked the dead panzers. Then he noted something that no claim sheet captured. Finally, the Typhoons couldn't find any more panzers, so they bore down on us and chased us mercilessly. Their shells fell with a terrible howl. One fell right next to a comrade of mine, but he didn't get hurt. These rockets burst into just a few big pieces of shrapnel, and a man had a chance of not being hit. That last sentence is careful and important. Josipite wasn't describing total devastation. He was describing surviving multiple rocket attacks, describing the near-miss experience honestly, the howl, the blast, the shrapnel from a rocket that missed, and noting that survival was possible. He and his comrade were alive. But the tanks around them were dispersing, pulling off the roads, getting under tree cover wherever cover existed. The 2nd SS Panzer Division's vehicles, under those conditions, stopped moving forward. Josipite's survival is evidence of rockets missing. The advance being halted is evidence of the rockets working. Air Marshal Koningham, commanding 2nd TAF, described what the effect looked like from above as the afternoon wore on. As the tempo of the attacks increased, so did the morale of the tank crews diminish. And at the height of the battle, it was observed that the enemy weren't waiting to stand our fire. The action of the Typhoons made many of them abandon their tanks and take cover away from them. He was watching the suppression effect in real time. The tanks being abandoned weren't burning tanks. They were the same tanks the ORS would find intact on August 13th. Crews bailing from undamaged vehicles to seek cover in hedgerows while their machines sat in the road. A battalion commander from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, interviewed after the war by the historian who compiled the primary RAF account of this engagement, described the result in 4 words. "Your fighter bombers simply nailed us to the ground." He pressed his thumb hard against a tabletop to demonstrate. Then he added a catchphrase that had circulated among German soldiers in Normandy. "If the aircraft above us are camouflaged, they are British. If they are silver, they are American. And if they aren't there at all, they are German." At the operational command level, the German records from the afternoon of August 7th speak in the same voice as Josipite and the unnamed battalion commander, just in official language. The 47th Panzer Corps daily report stated, "Continuation of the attack during the midday hours was made impossible because of enemy air superiority. The attack was bogged down since 1300 hours because of heavy enemy fighter-bomber operations and the failure of our Luftwaffe. At 1520 hours, German command received the report that the 1st SS Panzer Division's advance had been brought to a complete halt as a result of fighter-bomber action in a position 2 kilometers east of Juvigny. By 2035 hours, General Funk of 47th Panzer Corps was telling 7th Army that the tank situation was very serious. Von Kluge's response was to order the panzers to push through, regardless of cost, and advance through the night. The furthest advance had already stopped at Le Mesnil-Adelais, 14 miles from Avranches, and it never moved again. Field Marshal Rommel had described the underlying operational reality in Normandy weeks before Mortain, in a report that has the quality of a man stating something he had watched with his own eyes long enough to accept as permanent. Our own operations are rendered extraordinarily difficult and in part impossible to carry out, owing to the exceptionally strong and in some respects overwhelming superiority of the enemy air force. The enemy has complete command of the air over the battle zone and up to about 100 kilometers behind the front, and cuts off by day almost all traffic on roads. German forces across Normandy had already adapted to this reality before August 7th. Major movement was confined to darkness, night convoys, pre-dawn repositioning, careful concealment by day. One German post-war assessment described the operational consequence in blunt terms. All our movements could, during clear weather, only be accomplished during the night. During these few hours, we experienced overloading of the road and railroad network with resulting traffic jams. All our movements could be executed only slowly and with many difficulties and losses. The enemy was able to execute his movements at least twice as fast as we carried out ours. Daylight movement was operationally suicidal under Allied air cover. Every German armoured commander in Normandy understood this by August. Operation Lüttich broke that operational discipline deliberately, on Hitler's direct order in daylight, on a road network that offered no concealment, against an enemy with both intelligence warning and complete air superiority overhead. The Typhoons, arriving at noon on August 7th, weren't creating a new tactical problem for the German armour. They were enforcing an existing operational constraint at maximum intensity at the worst possible moment, on 4 panzer divisions that had no choice but to sit on the roads their mission required them to use. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to both Rommel and von Kluge during the campaign, wrote in his 1950 memoir Invasion 1944 that the armoured operation was completely wrecked exclusively by the Allied air forces, supported by a highly trained ground wireless telephone organisation. This is a post-war attribution, written by a German officer who had reasons to emphasise air power, shifting responsibility toward the Luftwaffe, which had made few friends in Normandy, and away from the command decisions that launched an operation with compromised intelligence and insufficient force. Read it accordingly. But it corroborates what the contemporaneous battle reports already documented. By 1300 hours on August 7th, the German advance had stopped moving, and air power was the stated reason in the German records filed that same afternoon. The ORS found the physical evidence of that halt when it examined the field 5 days later. 7 rocket kills among the examined tanks. 11 tanks abandoned, intact, or destroyed by their own crews. 19 tanks killed by the 30th Infantry Division's anti-tank weapons. Ground forces did most of the actual killing. Air power made it possible. not by destroying the attacking vehicles, but by making movement itself too costly to continue, and by fixing the columns in place where the 30th Division's guns could work them over without the confusion of a continuing advance. The 84-tank figure didn't stay inside the intelligence files. The official RAF narrative on Mortain, compiled from operational records before the ORS findings were available, described the day's operations in language that emphasized destruction. Eisenhower's post-campaign assessment credited air power specifically for halting the Mortain thrust. The early retellings made the day into a story of the Typhoon as a direct tank killer, an aircraft that could stop a panzer corps not by enabling the ground forces to hold, but by destroying the corps from the air. The institutional incentives behind maintaining that framing were real and predictable. The 2nd Tactical Air Force was a relatively new organization built around tactical air support doctrine, and the Typhoon represented its primary investment in ground attack capability. An aircraft that claimed 84 tanks in a single afternoon was an argument for investment, for doctrine, for organizational independence. An aircraft that suppressed German armor, while the 30th Infantry Division did the direct killing, was a harder case to make in post-war planning documents. The ORS findings circulated in technical channels and remained there. Ian Goodison's 1991 journal article in the Journal of Strategic Studies was among the first systematic scholarly challenges to the overclaiming figures in the open literature. His 1998 monograph, Air Power at the Battlefront, provided the full academic treatment, including the ORS data and the suppression versus destruction framework. The gap between 1944 and 1991 was nearly 50 years. During those decades, popular and semi-popular military histories reproduced the inflated claims as established fact. The Falaise pocket operations, which followed Mortain by 10 days, helped insulate the myth against scrutiny. At Falaise, between August 18th and 21st, retreating German columns caught in the open, largely out of fuel, without air cover, were genuinely devastated. ORS investigators found 667 German tanks, self-propelled guns, and armoured vehicles left behind in the pocket. The real documented devastation at Falaise made the Mortain claims easier to believe retrospectively. The two operations blurred in popular memory, with Falaise's genuine effectiveness seeming to retroactively confirm what the Typhoons had supposedly done at Mortain. Goodison's conclusion in Air Power at the Battlefront frames the corrected verdict with precision. Disruption and demoralization resulting from air attack was, in many ways, more important than the physical destruction caused, especially in attacks on armor in the open. That framing doesn't vindicate the kill claims. It replaces them with something more operationally meaningful. Rockets with a 0.7% hit probability per salvo against individual tanks could never have produced 84 kills from 2,088 shots. The math is straightforward enough that anyone examining it closely would have noticed the impossibility. But 2,088 rockets launched against a panzer column in open terrain, delivered continuously over 8 hours by aircraft the defending forces had no means to drive away, could and did produce something the claim sheet had no column for: operational paralysis across an entire sector. A Panzer Division commander who wanted to resume his advance after 1,300 hours on August 7th faced a concrete problem with no good solution. Every vehicle that moved onto a road became a target for aircraft returning every 20 minutes. The bocage terrain offered concealment, but prevented coordinated forward movement. The road corridors, operationally necessary for the advance, were simultaneously operationally lethal. Staying under tree cover meant not advancing. Advancing meant accepting the rocket attacks. For crews who had already experienced multiple near-miss detonations, shaking their vehicles and driving their infantry to ground, who had seen what a direct hit did to adjacent vehicles, the rational choice was to stop. The Falaise data, examined properly, confirms the pattern at a different scale. Of 385 armoured vehicles examined in the Falaise Pocket Survey, 14 were destroyed by rockets, 4 by bombs, 21 by aircraft cannon. Those three categories together accounting for just under 10% of examined vehicles. The two largest categories were 148 vehicles destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, 39.5%, and 121 vehicles abandoned undamaged, 31.5%. Nearly three-quarters of the vehicles at Falaise were left behind, not because Allied weapons destroyed them, but because their crews had no fuel, no orders that made sense, or no will to continue an advance under conditions where air power made daylight movement untenable. Air power's largest contribution at Falaise wasn't destruction. It was what it had always been in Normandy, movement denial, forcing German columns to move at night on overloaded roads, and eventually, at Falaise, interdicting the supply lines so thoroughly that the panzers ran out of fuel before they could escape. At Mortain, the same effect was concentrated into a single afternoon. The rockets that missed their individual tanks still detonated close enough to crews, close enough to the columns, close enough to the commanders issuing forward orders to make continuing the advance a gamble no one would accept when the aircraft were overhead. The ORS found the evidence distributed across 43 examined vehicles, 7 with rocket damage, 11 intact and abandoned, 19 killed by the men holding the ground. A 12-to-1 overclaim ratio that, once properly interpreted, maps accurately onto what the weapon actually accomplished. The pilots came home claiming 84 tanks destroyed. The battlefield said 7. Both numbers are real, and the discrepancy between them isn't the story of a weapon that failed or of men who exaggerated dishonestly. It's the story of a measurement system designed to count burning hulls when the decisive effect of the weapon was on vehicles that didn't burn and didn't advance. On August 13, 1944, the investigators drove out of those Mortain lanes and wrote down what they found. German armour dispersed off the roads, tucked under the Norman tree lines, intact, not burning, not destroyed. Engines cold, crews absent, vehicles undamaged and going nowhere. 14 miles from the Atlantic coast, 4 panzer divisions that had been ordered recklessly to the sea stood stationary in the fields of the bocage, halted not primarily by the 7 tanks the rockets had actually destroyed, but by the operational reality the rockets had created. The Typhoon didn't need to destroy the German armour to defeat it. It needed to make movement across that landscape cost more than any rational commander would pay. At Mortain, on August 7, 1944, that is exactly what it did. That was the kill, not the flamers in the debrief notebooks. The column that was still there, undamaged, engines cold, 14 miles short of its objective, because nobody inside those tanks was willing to move while the aircraft kept coming. Subscribe for more stories like this.